The first rule of surviving the frontier is simple. If the storm doesn't kill you, the silence will. Daniel Carter learned that lesson 3 years into his contract on Kepler Outpost 9, a lonely mining relay sitting on a frozen rock nearly 200 million miles from the nearest human colony. The wind outside howled like a freight train tearing across the ice plains, rattling the rusted antenna tower above his head as he knelt beside a half-open signal beacon, gloved hands buried deep in a tangle of frozen wiring. His visor display blinked amber warnings across the corner of his vision. Temperature, -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind speed, 70 miles per hour. Visibility, barely 10 feet. In other words, a perfectly normal afternoon on this miserable planet. Daniel tightened the final bolt with a multi-tool and leaned back, breathing slowly while the thin heater coils in his survival suit struggled to keep up with the cold. The beacon hummed to life with a faint electrical whine, sending a thin blue pulse into the white sky. "There," he muttered, his voice echoing inside the helmet. "Maybe someone out there will remember this place exists." The outpost behind him was a collection of metal buildings half buried in drifting ice, abandoned years ago when the mining companies pulled out. Daniel stayed because salvaging old tech paid better than going back to Earth with empty pockets. Most days were quiet, too quiet, but that afternoon the silence broke. His motion sensor flickered. Daniel frowned and turned his helmet slightly. A faint heat signature pulsed at the edge of the scanner grid, roughly 30 feet away beyond a ridge of shattered ice. At first he thought it was a glitch. Nothing alive should have been out there in weather like this. Then the signal moved. Slow, unsteady. Daniel stood up carefully, boots crunching over frost-hardened ground. The storm pushed against him as he stepped forward, each gust rattling the loose panels of his suit. 10 steps. 15. 20. Then he saw her. At first she looked like part of the wreckage scattered across the ice field. A tall shape half buried in drifting snow, armor plates reflecting faint copper light through the blizzard. But as Daniel moved closer, the figure shifted slightly, and 2 glowing golden eyes opened beneath a cracked helmet visor. The woman staring at him was easily 8 feet tall, even lying on the ground, her skin a deep blue that shimmered faintly beneath the damaged armor covering her shoulders. Alien. Warrior, judging by the design of the suit. And very much alive. Daniel froze. Because those golden eyes weren't just watching him. They were measuring him. Calculating. A soft mechanical hiss escaped her armor as she lifted one arm, slowly, painfully, until the barrel of a strange weapon pointed directly at his chest. Even through the roaring wind, he heard her voice, calm and sharp, through whatever translator her suit carried. "Stay where you are, human." Daniel raised both hands instinctively, his breath fogging the inside of his visor. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm not here to fight anybody." For several long seconds neither of them moved while the storm screamed across the empty plain around them. Then the alien woman's gaze narrowed slightly, studying him the way a scientist might study an unexpected experiment. "Then tell me," she said slowly, "why you approached me instead of running away." Daniel glanced once at the motionless beacon behind him, then back at the towering warrior lying in the ice. A small shrug lifted his shoulders. "Because out here," he said, "leaving someone to freeze just feels wrong." The alien woman did not lower the weapon, but something in her posture shifted, as if she was reconsidering the situation rather than preparing for a fight. The storm roared across the ice field, throwing sharp grains of frozen dust against Daniel Carter's suit, while the temperature warning inside his visor blinked again. -43 degrees Fahrenheit now. Staying out here any longer would be dangerous for both of them. Daniel slowly lowered one hand and pointed toward the distant cluster of dark structures barely visible through the blowing snow. The abandoned research station sat about 300 feet away, its old communications tower leaning slightly like a tired metal skeleton against the gray sky. "There is shelter over there," he said calmly. "Heat too, if the generators are still alive." The alien woman's glowing eyes followed the direction of his gesture, then returned to him. For a long moment she said nothing. The weapon remained aimed at his chest, steady despite the wind pushing against her armor. Finally she spoke again, her voice carrying a strange calm authority that made the freezing wasteland feel like the least dangerous thing. "Nearby, humans are known for unpredictable decisions," she said. Approaching an armed warrior during a storm qualifies. Daniel let out a slow breath that fogged his visor. You are the one lying in the snow, he replied quietly. I am just the mechanic who happened to find you. The corners of her eyes narrowed slightly, as if the statement confused her. She studied him carefully, scanning every detail of the bulky survival suit, the faded patch on his shoulder that once marked a salvage contractor, the simple utility pack hanging from his belt. Daniel noticed the faint tremor running through the damaged armor plates across her shoulder. Even warriors could freeze. The wind surged harder, and the alien woman finally lowered the weapon a few inches. Not enough to signal trust, but enough to signal a decision. If you attempt deception, she said slowly, my armor systems will respond. Daniel gave a small nod. Fair enough. He stepped closer carefully, each movement slow and deliberate so she could track it. Up close, the scale of her armor became even more obvious. The metal plates were designed for someone far larger and stronger than any human soldier, layered with curved segments that glowed faintly with fading energy lines. Several of those lines flickered unevenly, and the right side of the suit looked like it had absorbed a serious impact earlier in the day. Daniel did not ask questions. Out here, curiosity could wait until survival came first. Can you stand? He asked. She paused before answering. Yes. The words sounded confident, but when she shifted her weight, the armor produced a sharp mechanical protest, and her balance wavered for a moment. Daniel instinctively reached out to steady her, then immediately stopped halfway when those golden eyes snapped toward his hand. For a second, the wind and the world seemed to freeze along with him. Sorry, he said quickly, pulling his hand back. Human reflex. The alien woman watched him carefully, then slowly rose to her full height. Even with damaged armor, she towered over him by nearly 2 feet, a living statue of blue skin and copper metal against the white storm. She took one step forward, then another, each movement controlled but slightly heavy, as if the suit was working harder than it should. Daniel turned toward the distant station and started walking through the blowing snow, trusting that if she decided to change her mind, he would hear the weapon long before anything else happened. After several seconds, he heard the heavy metallic steps following behind him. The storm swallowed their footprints almost immediately as the two unlikely figures crossed the frozen plain together toward the dark silhouette of shelter waiting ahead. The door of the abandoned research station groaned like an old ship hull when Daniel forced it open with both hands. Frozen hinges protested under the pressure before finally giving way, releasing a blast of stale, metallic air that smelled faintly of dust and old circuitry. Compared to the storm outside, it felt almost warm. Daniel stepped inside first, boots echoing against the metal floor, and immediately switched on the small utility light mounted on his wrist. A pale white beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of dusty consoles, cracked glass panels, and long silent machines that had once studied this frozen world before the mining companies lost interest. The wind outside slammed against the outer walls like a distant ocean. Behind him, the tall alien warrior paused at the entrance, her silhouette filling the doorway while snow spiraled around her armor. For a moment, she simply stood there, scanning the room with the glowing sensors embedded in her suit. Then she stepped inside. The heavy door slid closed with effort once Daniel forced it back into place, sealing the station from the raging storm. The difference was immediate. The screaming wind vanished, replaced by the quiet hum of dormant technology and the soft ticking of metal slowly adjusting to temperature changes. Daniel exhaled slowly and removed his helmet. His dark hair fell messily across his forehead, damp from sweat despite the freezing conditions outside. The alien woman watched the motion closely. Without the helmet between them, the difference in their height felt even more dramatic. She towered over him like a statue carved from blue crystal and copper metal. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Daniel walked toward a nearby control panel mounted along the wall and wiped a layer of frost from the dusty surface with his glove. The display flickered weakly when he pressed the power switch. Old systems sometimes still had enough reserve power to wake up if treated gently. A few seconds later, a faint mechanical vibration traveled through the floor. Somewhere deeper in the station, a backup generator coughed. Awake after years of silence. Dim amber lights flickered across the ceiling panels one by one, slowly pushing back the darkness. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. Well, he said quietly, looks like we are not completely forgotten after all. When he turned back toward the center of the room, the alien warrior had moved closer, studying the equipment with a careful curiosity that did not match her earlier hostility. Up close, the damage to her armor was even clearer. One of the shoulder plates hung slightly loose, and several thin lines of energy along the chest piece pulsed weakly like a tired heartbeat. Daniel noticed the subtle stiffness in her movements as she shifted her weight. Even warriors had limits. The alien woman finally spoke again, her voice echoing softly through the large, empty chamber. Your species repairs abandoned technology rather than abandoning it. Daniel shrugged as he knelt beside a portable heater unit and began adjusting its controls. Machines deserve a second chance, he replied. Most of the time they just need someone stubborn enough to try. After a few seconds, the heater sputtered to life, pushing a weak stream of warm air into the cold room. It was not much, but compared to -40 degrees outside, it felt like stepping into a summer evening. The alien woman watched him silently for another moment before slowly unclipping a small device from her damaged armor. A faint projection flickered above it, displaying symbols Daniel did not recognize. She studied the readout, then lifted her gaze back toward him. Human Daniel Carter, she said carefully, the translator adjusting to pronounce his name with surprising accuracy. Your assistance is unusual. Daniel blinked in surprise. You already scanned my identity? The alien warrior tilted her head slightly. Your beacon transmitted more information than a simple distress signal. For a moment, Daniel simply laughed under his breath. That thing finally worked. The tall woman regarded him with quiet intensity, golden eyes reflecting the soft amber lights around them. Then she asked the question that changed the air in the room. Tell me, human, she said calmly, why risk your life for a stranger from another world? Daniel Carter leaned back slightly against the metal console while the heater hummed softly beside him, pushing weak warmth through the dusty room. The question hung in the air between them like a quiet challenge. The alien warrior stood almost motionless beneath the dim amber lights, her blue skin reflecting the glow of the ceiling panels while faint energy lines along her damaged armor pulsed unevenly. Her golden eyes never left his face. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully before answering. Honestly, he said, out here there are not many people left to help. The alien woman tilted her head slightly, as if translating the meaning behind his words rather than the words themselves. Daniel stepped away from the console and walked toward a nearby metal crate that had once held research equipment. He brushed a thick layer of dust aside and sat down slowly, the metal creaking under his weight. The warmth from the heater was finally beginning to take the sharp edge off the cold that had followed them inside. Most folks who worked this station left about 10 years ago, he continued. Mining companies found better places to dig, so they packed up the expensive machines and forgot the rest of us were even here. The alien warrior listened without interruption. Her posture remained strong, but the subtle stiffness in her stance had not disappeared. The damaged armor across her shoulder gave off a faint mechanical click every time she shifted slightly. Daniel noticed it again and nodded toward the plate. Your suit does not look happy. For the first time, a faint expression crossed her face. Not pain exactly. Something closer to annoyance. She reached up and pressed a small control on the side of the armor. A thin blue interface projected briefly in the air before fading again. The impact regulators are failing, she said calmly. Environmental shielding is reduced by 30%. Daniel let out a low whistle. That explains why you looked like you were turning into an ice sculpture outside. The alien woman studied him carefully again, clearly trying to determine whether humor was an intentional human strategy or simply a strange habit. After a moment, she spoke again. Your response does not match your circumstances. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Meaning? You are isolated, she explained. Your equipment is minimal. Your location is strategically unimportant. Yet you behave as if your survival is not your primary concern. Daniel chuckled quietly and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You ever met a human mechanic before? The alien warrior remained silent. We fix things, he said. Simply. Broken engines. Old satellites. Sometimes even people who crash land in the middle of a blizzard. The heater continued to hum while the storm battered the outside walls of the station. Somewhere deep in the structure, an old ventilation system began circulating air again, producing a faint metallic echo that drifted through the empty corridors. The alien woman finally stepped closer to the heater, the warmth brushing against the blue surface of her skin. For a moment, she simply stood there, studying the flickering heat coils as if they were an unfamiliar form of technology. Then her golden eyes shifted back toward Daniel. "Among my people," she said slowly, "aid is rarely given without purpose." Daniel considered that for a moment. Then he shrugged. Maybe that is the difference. She watched him with renewed intensity. "Explain." Daniel leaned back against the crate again and glanced toward the dim ceiling lights above them. "Where I come from," he said quietly. "Sometimes the reason you help someone is just because they are there." The alien warrior did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached up slowly and touched the edge of the damaged shoulder plate on her armor. The metal latch released with a soft mechanical click, loosening the heavy segment slightly, as if she was considering removing it. Her eyes remained locked on Daniel as she spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a new curiosity. "Human Daniel Carter," she said carefully. "If you expect nothing in return for your actions, then tell me one thing." Daniel looked up. "What is that?" The alien warrior held his gaze steadily. "What do you want?" The question settled into the quiet room with surprising weight. The heater hummed softly beside them, while faint amber lights reflected across the smooth blue surface of the alien woman's skin. Outside, the storm continued to howl against the metal walls of the station, but inside the air felt still, almost thoughtful. Daniel Carter looked at her for a long moment before answering. He had been asked many questions during his years drifting between forgotten mining outposts and abandoned research stations. Most of them were simple ones about contracts, fuel supplies, or broken transmitters. This one felt different. The alien warrior stood near the heater with her towering frame, relaxed just slightly, the loosened shoulder plate of her armor resting unevenly against the rest of the suit. The faint energy lines along her chest continued their slow pulse like a tired machine refusing to shut down. Her golden eyes watched him carefully, not impatient, not demanding, simply waiting. Daniel leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees and let out a quiet breath. "That is a dangerous question," he said. The alien woman tilted her head slightly. "Explain." Daniel rubbed his hands together near the heater coils, letting the warmth soak slowly into his fingers. "Because when people ask that question," he said, "they usually expect a complicated answer." The alien warrior studied him with steady curiosity. "And you do not have one?" Daniel shrugged. "Not really." He glanced toward the old control panel across the room, where dim system lights flickered slowly in the dust. Then he looked back at her again. Up close he could see the faint patterns in her skin that caught the amber light like polished glass. She looked powerful, disciplined, and completely out of place inside a forgotten human research station. Daniel realized that if anyone back on Earth saw this moment through the station cameras, they would probably assume he had lost his mind. A lone salvage mechanic sitting calmly beside a towering alien warrior while a storm buried the planet outside. He let out a quiet laugh at the thought. The alien woman's gaze narrowed slightly at the sound. "Your reaction suggests uncertainty." Daniel nodded once. "Maybe a little." For a moment neither of them spoke while the heater continued its steady hum. Then Daniel lifted his head and met her eyes directly. His voice was calm, but honest in the way people only sound when they stop trying to impress anyone. "If you really want the truth," he said slowly, "right now I want two things." The alien warrior listened without interrupting. "First," Daniel continued, "I want this old station to stay warm long enough for both of us to walk out of here tomorrow." Her eyes remained fixed on him. "And the second?" Daniel hesitated for the briefest moment. The silence stretched just long enough for the sound of the storm outside to slip faintly through the metal walls. Then he answered, "You." The word hung in the air before either of them moved. Daniel immediately felt the weight of what he had said, not because he meant anything inappropriate, but because humans had a long tradition of saying the wrong thing at the wrong moment. For several seconds the alien woman did not react at all. Her golden eyes simply remained on him, studying his expression with intense focus, as if measuring the exact meaning behind the word. Then, slowly, she reached up toward the damaged shoulder plate of her armor. The metal latch released with a soft mechanical sound that echoed faintly through the quiet station. Daniel blinked in surprise as the heavy plate shifted slightly away from the rest of the suit. The alien woman did not look embarrassed. She did not look angry either. Instead, her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful, as her hand moved to the next set of armor seals along her chest. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet composure as before. "You humans," she said slowly, "are remarkably direct creatures." Daniel Carter did not move when the armor plate shifted. The quiet metallic sound seemed louder than the storm outside. The alien woman stood only a few feet away now, the heater casting soft amber reflections across the curved lines of her damaged suit. One of the shoulder segments slowly separated from the locking frame and slid downward with a controlled mechanical release. It landed against the metal floor with a dull, heavy sound that echoed through the silent research station. Daniel blinked once, unsure whether he had misunderstood the moment completely. The alien warrior did not appear embarrassed or dramatic. She simply continued watching him with calm golden eyes, as if this reaction made perfect sense to her. Daniel raised both hands slightly in a cautious gesture. "Just to clarify something," he said carefully. "When I said that word, I was not exactly requesting a demonstration." The alien woman tilted her head slightly, as if reviewing the translation inside her armor systems. "Your vocal tone contained hesitation," she replied. "Yet your statement was precise." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck again. "Humans are complicated like that." The alien warrior considered this quietly while her hand moved to the next set of armor seals along her upper chest. Thin lines of blue light flickered across the metal surface as the suit partially disengaged its outer shell. The process looked less like removing clothing and more like unlocking a piece of advanced engineering that had been built around her body. Daniel noticed that as the heavy outer plates separated slightly, the faint tremor he had seen earlier in her movements began to ease. The armor had been supporting her for hours through the freezing storm, and now the suit was clearly struggling to maintain its power levels. She finally paused and looked back toward him again. "Your statement indicated desire," she said calmly. "Among my people, honesty requires a response." Daniel leaned back slightly on the crate, processing that explanation. The heater hummed beside him while snow tapped faintly against the reinforced windows of the station. "You are saying that if someone says they want something," he replied slowly, "you simply hand it over." The alien woman's expression shifted very slightly. It was not amusement exactly, but it was close. "Not something," she corrected. "Someone." Daniel stared at her for a second before letting out a quiet breath of disbelief. "That system probably causes misunderstandings." "Often," she admitted. The remaining shoulder section unlocked with another quiet click and loosened from the main frame of the suit. Beneath the heavy armor, the inner structure of the equipment revealed smooth, layered materials designed for mobility and protection rather than combat display. The alien warrior flexed one arm slowly, as if testing the restored range of motion. The earlier stiffness had almost disappeared. Daniel watched carefully, his mechanic instincts automatically studying the suit design with curiosity. The technology was far beyond anything used by human mining companies. After a moment, she looked at him again. "Your reaction does not match your statement." Daniel gave a small smile. "Because humans also have another rule." The alien woman waited. "When someone gives you something important," Daniel said, "you usually make sure you actually deserve it first." The alien warrior studied him again with that same focused intensity she had used since the moment they met in the storm. The heater continued pushing warm air through the dusty room while the station's old generator hummed somewhere in the distance. Finally, she spoke again, her voice quieter now, but carrying a new curiosity. "Then tell me, human Daniel Carter," she said slowly, "what would make you deserve it?" Daniel Carter let the question sit in the air for a moment while the heater continued pushing a slow wave of warmth across the cold metal floor. Outside, the storm roared against the station walls, but inside the quiet had grown almost thoughtful. The alien warrior stood only a few feet away now, one heavy section of armor resting on the ground beside her, while the remaining pieces hummed faintly with fading power. Without the rigid shoulder plates locking her posture, her stance looked less like a statue and more like a living being who had been standing in battle gear far too long. Daniel leaned back slightly against the crate and crossed his arms, studying her with the calm patience of someone used to working with complicated machines. That depends on what you think you are offering, he said. The alien woman watched him carefully. The golden glow in her eyes reflected the heater coils like small suns. You asked for me, she replied. That is what I am offering. Daniel exhaled quietly through his nose. That is exactly the problem. She tilted her head again, the motion slow and deliberate as if analyzing every word. Daniel gestured toward the armor pieces resting on the floor beside her. Where I come from, he said. If someone removes their armor around you, it means one of two things. Either they trust you, or they think you are harmless. For the first time, something resembling amusement crossed the alien warrior's expression. Which do you believe applies here? Daniel smiled faintly. Honestly, I am still figuring that out. The heater crackled softly as a burst of warmer air rolled across the room. The old research station groaned quietly as the storm outside shifted direction again. The alien woman took one slow step closer to the heater and extended her hands slightly toward the warmth, the motion almost absent-minded. Without the heavy outer plates, the remaining layers of her suit moved smoothly with her body instead of resisting each motion. Daniel noticed the way her shoulders relaxed by a small but visible degree. Among my people, she said after a moment, removing armor is not a sign of weakness. Daniel nodded. I figured that. Her gaze returned to him. It is a declaration. Daniel raised one eyebrow. Of what? The alien warrior studied him in silence for a few seconds before answering. Of trust. The words settled into the quiet room with surprising weight. Daniel looked down briefly at the armor piece resting on the floor between them. The metal surface still carried faint frost from the storm outside. You trust people pretty quickly, he said. You dragged me out of a storm without hesitation, she replied calmly. My decision seems reasonable by comparison. Daniel could not argue with that logic. He leaned forward slightly and rested his hands on his knees again. Trust is not the same thing as deserving something, he said quietly. The alien warrior waited. Daniel glanced up at her again and spoke with the same simple honesty he had used from the beginning. If I deserve anything from you, he said, it probably starts with knowing your name. The alien woman remained perfectly still for a moment. Then she straightened slightly, the dim lights reflecting across her blue skin as if the simple request had shifted something important in the room. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the quiet strength of someone used to being heard without repeating herself. Lysera, she said. Daniel nodded once and gave a small, genuine smile. Nice to meet you, Lysera. The alien warrior watched him closely for another moment before asking one more question, her voice softer now, but far more curious than before. And now that you know my name, human Daniel Carter, she said slowly, do you still want me? Daniel Carter did not answer immediately. The question hung between them while the heater continued its quiet hum and the storm pressed against the distant walls of the station like a restless ocean. Lysera stood across from him beneath the dim amber lights, tall and steady now that the damaged armor had loosened its grip on her movements. Without the rigid plates locking her shoulders in place, the way she carried herself had changed. She looked less like a weapon designed for war and more like a traveler who had been standing guard for far too long. Daniel studied her for a moment before speaking. That depends on what you think I meant, he said calmly. Lysera watched him with the same focused attention she had shown since the moment they met on the ice. Her golden eyes reflected the glow of the heater coils, steady and curious rather than impatient. Your words were clear, she replied. You said you wanted me. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, he said. But humans do not always mean that the same way it sounds. The alien warrior tilted her head slightly again, the small motion becoming familiar. Then explain the human meaning. Daniel leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees once more, letting the warmth from the heater soak into his hands. For a moment, he listened to the old generator vibrating somewhere deeper in the station before answering. Back home, he said quietly, when someone says they want a person, it usually means they want that person to stay. Lysera remained perfectly still as she processed the sentence. Daniel continued before she could interrupt. Not as property, not as a prize, just around. He gestured lightly toward the room around them. Someone to talk to while the snow buries the planet outside. The alien warrior's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she was adjusting her understanding of the situation piece by piece. You desire companionship. Daniel smiled faintly. That sounds a lot less dramatic, but yes. For several seconds Lysera said nothing. The heater continued blowing warm air across the room, while the dim lights of the station flickered softly overhead. Daniel noticed that the faint tension in her posture had eased even more. Her breathing had slowed now that the cold of the storm was no longer draining the suit's power. Finally, she spoke again. "Among my people," she said slowly, "companionship is rarely separated from purpose." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Humans mix the two all the time." Lycera studied him with renewed interest. "Why?" Daniel shrugged. "Because life gets very quiet if you do not." The alien warrior looked around the abandoned research station for the first time with something closer to understanding. Dust covered the consoles. The windows showed nothing but swirling white outside. The only sound in the building came from an aging generator and a single heater fighting against the frozen planet. When her gaze returned to Daniel, the intensity in her eyes had softened slightly. "Then your answer remains the same," she said. "You still want me?" Daniel gave a small nod. "Yes." Lycera considered this calmly before speaking again. "That is acceptable." Daniel blinked once. "Acceptable?" "Yes." Her voice remained steady. "However, your explanation changes the meaning of my response." Daniel leaned back slightly, curiosity replacing his earlier caution. "And what does that mean?" Lycera looked down briefly at the piece of armor resting on the floor beside her, then back at him again. The glow of the heater reflected across her blue skin as she spoke. "If companionship is what you seek, human Daniel Carter," she said quietly, "then I will remain here until the storm ends." The words sounded simple, but something about the calm certainty behind them made the empty station feel less abandoned than it had only minutes earlier. The storm outside continued its relentless assault on the frozen planet, but inside the old research station the air had grown strangely calm. Daniel Carter sat quietly on the metal crate, while the heater pushed steady waves of warmth into the room. Across from him, Lycera stood beside the fallen armor plate, her tall silhouette outlined by the soft amber glow of the station lights. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt unfamiliar. Daniel glanced toward the frost-coated window panels along the far wall, where swirling snow erased any sign of the landscape beyond. "You know," he said after a while, "this is the first time in 3 months that someone else has been inside this building." Lycera turned her head slightly toward the window, as if studying the invisible storm beyond it. "Your species tolerates isolation better than most," she replied. Daniel chuckled quietly. "Tolerate is a generous word." He leaned forward and adjusted the heater controls, letting the warmth rise another few degrees. The temperature display on the wall crept slowly upward, now reading 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Still cold by Earth standards, but far better than the lethal conditions outside. Lycera watched the small machine with thoughtful curiosity. "Your technology is inefficient," she observed. Daniel nodded without offense. "It is also stubborn," he said. "That tends to keep humans alive in places where we probably should not be." The alien warrior considered that for a moment before slowly lowering herself onto a nearby equipment crate across from him. Even seated, she remained nearly as tall as Daniel, her posture naturally straight despite the long hours she must have spent inside her armor. Without the rigid plates around her shoulders, the movement looked easier now, more natural. Daniel noticed that the faint tension he had seen earlier in her stance had almost disappeared entirely. The heater hummed steadily between them, while the station's ancient generator vibrated faintly beneath the metal floor. After a few quiet moments, Lycera spoke again. "Human Daniel Carter." Daniel looked up. "Yes. You said companionship prevents silence." He nodded. "Usually." Lycera's golden eyes studied him carefully again. "Then speak." Daniel laughed softly. "That is not exactly how conversation works." She waited. Daniel leaned back and crossed his arms, thinking for a moment before asking the first question that came to mind. "Where did you come from, Lycera?" The alien warrior's gaze shifted briefly toward the armor plate resting on the floor beside her before returning to him. "A long way from this world," she said calmly. Daniel smiled faintly. "That sounds familiar." Lycera tilted her head slightly. "You are also far from your origin planet." Daniel nodded. "About 200 million miles from the nearest human city." Lycera processed the distance silently before speaking again. "Your species travels far for resources." "We travel far for everything," Daniel replied. "Resources, curiosity, sometimes just because the stars look interesting. The alien warrior seemed to consider that answer carefully. Curiosity, she repeated. Daniel nodded again. That one gets us into trouble more often than anything else. Lysera's expression softened slightly, as if the idea resonated in some quiet way. The heater continued to hum between them while the storm outside slowly began to weaken, the wind no longer striking the walls with quite the same intensity as before. After a moment, Lysera spoke again, her voice carrying the same calm strength it had since the beginning. Curiosity brought you to me. Daniel gave a small shrug. Partly. She studied him closely. What was the other part? Daniel looked at the fallen armor plate beside her, then back at the tall alien warrior sitting across from him in the dim light of the abandoned station. A small, thoughtful smile crossed his face before he answered. Kindness, he said quietly. Lysera did not answer immediately after Daniel spoke the word kindness. The quiet inside the research station seemed to grow deeper for a moment as the heater continued its steady hum and the generator vibrated faintly beneath the floor panels. The storm outside had softened into a distant roar instead of the violent pounding that had filled the air earlier. Daniel Carter leaned back slightly on the crate and watched the frost slowly melting along the edges of the window frames. Across from him, Lysera sat perfectly still, her tall frame relaxed but attentive as if the concept he had mentioned required careful consideration. Finally she spoke. Kindness is not a strategic principle among my people. Daniel smiled faintly. It is not a strategic principle among humans either. He replied. We just practice it anyway. Lysera studied him with quiet intensity, the golden glow in her eyes reflecting the heater coils between them. Your explanation suggests inefficiency, she said calmly. Daniel shrugged. Probably. The alien warrior glanced briefly toward the armor plate resting on the floor beside her, then back to him again. Yet you chose to risk exposure to the storm for a being you did not know. Daniel rubbed his hands together near the heater again, letting the warmth soak deeper into his fingers. Sometimes the simplest choice is the one that lets you sleep later, he said. Lysera tilted her head slightly, as if analyzing the phrase. Sleep appears to be important to humans. Daniel laughed quietly. It is amazing what a good night's sleep can fix. The alien warrior seemed to consider this carefully before asking another question. Would you have acted differently if you knew who I was? Daniel looked up at her with mild curiosity. Should I know who you are? Lysera did not answer right away. Instead, she looked slowly around the abandoned research station, observing the dusty consoles, the aging equipment, and the quiet lights flickering in the dim interior. When her gaze returned to Daniel, there was a subtle change in her expression. It was not arrogance. It was something closer to responsibility. Among my people, she said slowly, I hold command authority. Daniel nodded once as if she had told him the weather forecast. That explains the armor. Lysera watched him closely. You do not appear surprised. Daniel leaned back again and crossed his arms. Out here titles do not keep anyone warm, he replied. The alien warrior seemed to weigh that statement with careful thought. The heater continued to blow warm air between them, while the temperature display on the wall crept slowly upward to 39 degrees Fahrenheit. After a moment, Lysera spoke again, her voice slightly softer than before. If I had not survived the storm, she said, the consequences for my people would have been significant. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Then I am glad the beacon still works. Lysera looked at him with a new kind of curiosity. You still do not ask what position I hold. Daniel gave a small shrug. If it was important enough, you would have told me already. For the first time, a faint trace of amusement touched Lysera's expression. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. The alien warrior leaned slightly forward, resting her hands loosely together as she continued studying the human mechanic sitting across from her. Human Daniel Carter, she said slowly. Your reasoning remains unusual. Daniel smiled again. You have said that a few times. Lysera held his gaze steadily for another moment before asking one final question that carried far more meaning than the words themselves. If kindness is truly the reason you helped me, she said quietly, then what will you do when you learn why I was on this planet in the first place? Daniel Carter listened to the question without rushing to answer. The heater continued its steady hum between them, while the ancient generator deep within the research station vibrated like a distant heartbeat. Outside the reinforced walls, the storm had weakened even more. the wind now sliding across the frozen plains instead of hammering against the structure. The quiet that followed made the old building feel almost peaceful. Daniel leaned back slightly on the crate and folded his hands together while he thought. Across from him, Lysera remained seated with the same calm posture she had carried since revealing her command status. The fallen armor plate beside her reflected the warm light of the heater, a reminder that only a short time ago she had been standing in the middle of a deadly blizzard. Daniel finally spoke. "I will probably do the same thing I did before," he said. Lysera's golden eyes studied him carefully. "Which was?" Daniel gestured lightly around the dusty research station. "Help where I can and ask questions later." Lysera remained silent for several seconds, as if measuring whether that response was serious or simply human humor. The longer she watched him, the more certain it became that he was completely sincere. "You understand that my presence here was not accidental," she said slowly. Daniel nodded once. "I assumed that. This world was chosen for a reason," she continued. Daniel leaned forward slightly, curiosity sharpening his attention now. "Let me guess," he said quietly. "It has something to do with what the old mining companies left behind." Lysera's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel noticed immediately. "That was a good guess," she admitted. Daniel smiled faintly. "When people with advanced armor and command authority show up on a forgotten ice planet, there are usually only two possibilities." Lysera tilted her head slightly. "And the second?" Daniel pointed toward the floor beneath them. "Something valuable is buried under all this ice." Lysera did not answer right away, but the silence itself confirmed enough. Daniel leaned back again with a thoughtful look. "Now I am curious." The alien warrior regarded him with calm seriousness. "Curiosity can be dangerous." Daniel shrugged. "So can freezing to death outside." Lysera watched him for another long moment before speaking again. "Your species often chooses risk for reasons that are difficult to predict." Daniel chuckled quietly. "That is because we rarely agree with each other long enough to follow the same plan." The heater continued pushing warm air across the room, while the temperature display climbed slowly to 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The small improvement made the station feel almost comfortable compared to the frozen wasteland outside. Lysera glanced briefly toward the window where the storm clouds were beginning to thin. Faint light from the distant moons filtered through the swirling snow. When she looked back at Daniel, her expression carried a new seriousness. "What lies beneath this world," she said slowly, "is not simply valuable." Daniel listened carefully. "It is dangerous," she finished. Daniel nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he had suspected for a while. "That explains the armor." Lysera leaned forward slightly, her golden eyes focused on him with renewed intensity. "If the discovery beneath this planet spreads beyond controlled channels, many worlds could be affected." Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully for a moment. Then he looked up at her again with the same calm expression he had shown since the beginning. "And you think a mechanic living alone in a broken research station is going to complicate that plan?" Lysera answered without hesitation. "I believe you are the kind of person who changes situations simply by being present." Daniel stared at her for a second before letting out a quiet laugh. "That might be the nicest warning anyone has ever given me." Daniel Carter leaned back slightly on the crate while Lysera's words settled into the quiet station. The heater continued to push steady warmth into the room, and the temperature display climbed slowly to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside the window, the storm had weakened into drifting snow that moved across the frozen plain like slow white clouds. The silence that followed her warning did not feel threatening. It felt like the moment before someone decided whether a story should be told. Daniel rubbed his hands together and looked toward the frost-covered glass panels before answering. "Then it sounds like whatever you are protecting down there must be important." Lysera watched him carefully. The golden glow in her eyes reflected the dim station lights, as if she was weighing every word he said. "Important is not the correct word," she replied quietly. Daniel glanced back at her. "Dangerous was the word you used." Lysera gave a small nod. "Correct." Daniel rested his elbows on his knees again, listening to the quiet vibration of the old generator beneath the floor. "Then let me guess something else," he said. Lysera waited. Daniel pointed lightly toward the ground beneath the station. "Whatever it is, the mining companies never actually found it." Lysera's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. "Explain your reasoning." Daniel smiled faintly. "If they had found something that important, this station would not be empty. The alien warrior considered that for a moment before giving a slow approving nod. Your conclusion is accurate. Daniel leaned back again and let out a thoughtful breath. So you came here to make sure nobody else finds it. Lysra did not deny it. Instead, she looked toward the window where the storm clouds were beginning to thin enough for faint moonlight to reach the surface. The pale glow reflected across the ice fields outside like distant silver rivers. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quieter tone than before. My mission was to confirm the location of a buried structure beneath this region. Daniel blinked once. Structure? Lysra nodded. It predates both of our civilizations. Daniel sat up slightly now, curiosity replacing his earlier caution. You mean alien ruins? Lysra looked back at him with calm seriousness. Ancient technology left behind by a species that no longer exists. Daniel whistled softly under his breath. That explains the armor and the command authority. Lysra remained still. Some discoveries are too powerful to be released without preparation. Daniel nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense. The heater hummed between them, while the station lights flickered again overhead. So the big secret under the ice is not a weapon, he said quietly. Lysra studied him closely before answering. It could become one if misunderstood. Daniel considered that for several seconds. Then he looked toward the window again, where the storm had finally begun to fade completely. The snow now drifted slowly instead of racing across the sky. You know, he said thoughtfully, that might be the first time in history someone discovered ancient alien ruins and the biggest problem turned out to be people. Lysra tilted her head slightly. You say that as if it surprises you. Daniel gave a quiet laugh. It does not. He looked back at her with a calm expression. Humans are very talented at turning interesting discoveries into complicated situations. Lysra watched him carefully. The warmth from the heater reflected across her blue skin as she spoke again. Which is why I was sent alone to verify the site before others arrived. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Others? Lysra nodded once. A scientific expedition will reach this planet within 2 days. Daniel looked toward the silent station around them, and then back at the alien warrior sitting across from him. And you landed in the middle of a storm before they got here. Lysra answered calmly. Yes. Daniel smiled faintly. That sounds like something a human explorer would do. The storm was gone by the time the station lights dimmed into the quiet rhythm of the aging generator. Outside the frost-covered windows, the frozen plains stretched beneath a pale sky, where distant moons drifted slowly above the horizon. Daniel Carter stood near the glass panel with his arms folded while the heater continued to hum softly behind him. The snow had settled into gentle waves across the ice, and the world looked calm again, as if the violent storm from earlier had never existed. Behind him, Lysra rose from the equipment crate and walked slowly toward the window. Without the heavy armor plates weighing down her movements, she carried herself with natural balance, tall and steady as the soft amber lights reflected across her blue skin. She stopped beside Daniel and looked out across the silent landscape. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt different now, less like strangers sharing shelter and more like two travelers who had unexpectedly crossed the same road. Daniel finally broke the silence. Looks like the storm finally decided to leave us alone. Lysra studied the horizon where faint starlight reflected across the frozen ground. The atmosphere of this world shifts quickly, she said calmly. Daniel nodded slightly. Everything out here does. He glanced toward the distant plains again before speaking. 2 days until your expedition arrives. Lysra gave a slow nod. Yes. Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. And somewhere under all that ice there is a buried structure older than either of our civilizations. Lysra did not look away from the horizon. That is correct. Daniel let out a quiet breath that fogged the glass slightly before fading away. You know, he said, most people spend their whole lives hoping to discover something important. Lysra turned her head slightly toward him. Daniel gave a small smile. Turns out I just had to fix a broken beacon. Lysra studied him with the same thoughtful curiosity she had carried since the beginning. You do not seem troubled by what you have learned. Daniel shook his head slowly. The universe is full of strange things, he replied. Most of them are just waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. Lysra considered that answer carefully before speaking again. Your presence here will complicate my mission. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Because I know about the ruins. Lysra nodded. Daniel looked back out across the frozen plains where faint morning light was beginning to appear along the distant horizon. The long night of the storm was finally ending. Maybe, he said quietly. Or maybe it makes your mission easier. Lysra watched him carefully. Explain. Daniel gestured toward the silent research station around them. You said your expedition arrives in 2 days. Until then you have one advantage. Lysra waited. Daniel looked at her with the calm expression of someone who had spent years surviving alone on forgotten worlds. You have someone who already knows how to live on this planet. The alien warrior remained still for a moment before the faintest trace of understanding appeared in her eyes. Outside, the first pale sunlight touched the frozen surface of the planet, turning the endless ice fields into a sea of gold and silver. Daniel Carter stood beside the tall alien commander and watched the new day rise across the quiet world. Somewhere beneath the frozen ground, an ancient structure waited to be discovered, and for the first time in a very long time Daniel did not feel alone on the frontier of the stars.